That night, Kris Kristofferson had about 4 seconds. If he let the silence continue, someone at the table would eventually break it, and break it honestly. If he filled it too quickly, everyone would know he was managing something. The wine glasses had stopped moving. The laughter from 30 seconds ago had evaporated. Someone had said a name, just a woman's name, casually, in the middle of a story about a recording session. And now 8 people who made their living with words had suddenly forgotten how to use them. Kris reached for the wine bottle, poured slowly into the nearest glass, then his own. Asked about the new album someone was finishing. The moment moved. Voices returned. The dinner continued. Upstairs, his children were asleep. 3 states away, Rita Coolidge was performing. No one at the table asked where she was. It was 1978, late spring, Nashville. Kris's house sat far enough from the main road that you couldn't hear traffic, only cicadas and the occasional dog. Inside, the dining room was warm, informal, mismatched chairs, candles that had burned unevenly, the kind of space that suggested people gathered often, without ceremony. Tonight, it was writers mostly. A couple of session musicians, a journalist Kris respected enough to invite home. The kind of people who understood that some conversations happened around what wasn't said. They'd been talking for 2 hours. The food was gone. The wine kept appearing. Someone told a story about Willie, someone else about Waylon's latest clash with a label executive. The room had the comfortable disorder of people who'd known each other long enough to interrupt without offense. Then Stephen, a songwriter Kris had worked with on and off for years, mentioned her. Not deliberately. Not with intent. He was talking about a session about how a harmony line had come together unexpectedly, and he said, "You know, the way Sarah just knew where to come in without a chart, it reminded me of that thing Sammy does where she—" He stopped, not because he realized what he'd said, because everyone else had stopped listening to their own conversations and started listening to his. Sammy Smith. The name alone didn't carry scandal. She was a singer. Kris had written for her. She'd had a massive hit with Help Me Make It Through the Night. His song, her voice, a record that had made both of them a great deal of money and raised Kris's profile in ways that still mattered. But everyone at that table also knew that the song hadn't been the only thing between them. And everyone knew that Rita knew. And everyone knew that Rita was not in Nashville tonight. Kris didn't flinch, didn't stiffen, didn't glance away. He just reached for the wine bottle, steady, unhurried, and poured. First into the glass nearest him, which happened to be Stephen's, then into his own. "How's that album coming?" he asked, voice even, almost gentle. "The one you've been trying to finish since February?" Stephen blinked, picked up the thread, started talking about production problems, about a drummer who couldn't lock into the tempo they needed. The table exhaled. Someone laughed at something. Someone else asked about touring schedules. Within 90 seconds, the evening had returned to what it was before the name appeared. But Kris had felt it, not panic. He didn't panic, but a tightening, a small internal adjustment. The same feeling he got when a journalist asked a question that was technically fair but emotionally intrusive. The sensation of a boundary being approached, and the immediate, automatic decision to reinforce it without making the reinforcement visible. He'd become very good at this. The dinner had started simply. Kris liked having people over, liked cooking, even if he wasn't particularly skilled at it, liked the noise of a house that felt inhabited. The kids, Casey, who was 7, and Jesse, almost 5, had eaten earlier at the kitchen counter before being sent upstairs with books and promises that yes, they could stay up a little later if they stayed quiet. Rita was in Colorado, a festival date, part of a string of solo appearances she'd been doing more frequently. They'd talked that morning. The conversation had been cordial, logistical. She'd asked about the kids. He'd asked about the sound system at the venue. Neither had asked the other question. When she was gone, the house felt different, not emptier exactly, just less observed. Kris had invited people over without asking her opinion. It wasn't defiance. It was just easier. Easier to fill the house with voices that didn't require him to perform being present in his own marriage. By 8, people had arrived. Bottles of wine, a guitar someone left by the door. The kind of gathering that looked spontaneous but had been quietly arranged days before. Kris moved through it easily, poured drinks, told stories, listened more than he spoke, which people often mistook for depth when it was really just discipline. He'd learned early that if you asked the right follow-up questions, people rarely noticed you hadn't answered their initial ones. Dinner itself was loud, warm. Someone made a joke about record executives. Someone else about the new wave of pop country that was selling but had no soul. Kris stayed mostly quiet during that because he'd been accused of being part of the problem. The poet who'd gone Hollywood, the songwriter who'd chosen acting over authenticity. He didn't argue anymore. Arguing required caring what people thought, and he'd quietly stopped. Then Steven said the name, and for 4 seconds, the entire room held its breath. Kris didn't look at Steven. Looking would have made it worse, would have confirmed that the name mattered, that it required acknowledgement. Instead, he poured wine. Let the sound of liquid against glass fill the gap. Used the physical act to diffuse what could have become a moment. It was a trick he'd learned years ago, maybe from his father, maybe from the military. When a conversation moves towards something you don't want to engage, introduce a small, deliberate action. Light a cigarette, adjust a collar, pour a drink. It gives everyone permission to reset without calling attention to the reset itself. By the time he asked Steven about his album, the room had already begun to forgive the silence. But Kris knew. He knew that everyone at the table understood exactly what had almost surfaced. That they all carried the same information and had collectively agreed not to make it explicit. That this was how friendships in their world functioned, not through confrontation, but through an unspoken protocol of discretion. It should have felt comforting. It didn't. It felt like complicity. After the wine, the evening softened. Someone brought out the guitar, not for a performance, just for accompaniment. The kind of playing that happens when musicians are too full and too tired to be precious about it. A few songs cycled through. Carter Family Standards, a Hank Williams tune. Someone attempted a Kristofferson song, badly, and Kris smiled, but didn't correct them. Around 11, people started to leave, slowly, in the way that Nashville departures happen, with long goodbyes at the door and promises to reconvene soon. Steven was one of the last to go. He paused at the threshold, looked at Kris, and said quietly, "I wasn't thinking." Kris shook his head. Nothing to think about. Steven held his gaze for a moment. "All right. Drive safe?" "Yeah." The door closed. Kris stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the sound of Steven's truck fade down the gravel drive. Nothing to think about. The words had come out automatically, reflexively. The kind of thing you said when you wanted to smooth something over without addressing what it actually was. He'd meant it to sound reassuring. It sounded hollow. Inside, the house was a mess. Plates stacked unevenly, wine glasses with dark residue pooling at the bottom, candles burned down to stubs. Kris moved through the room slowly, gathering dishes, bringing them to the kitchen. He didn't clean them, just stacked them by the sink. Poured himself a final glass of wine and stood at the counter, looking out the window into the dark yard. The name had been said, not cruelly, not with judgment. Just said, and the whole room had recognized it for what it was. That was the part that sat uncomfortably. Not that people knew, of course they knew, people always knew, but that the knowing had become something everyone managed together. A collective decision to acknowledge and then immediately bury. Kris took a drink. He thought about Sammy. Not the affair itself, which had ended months ago, but the way it had started. Thoughtlessly, almost. A late session. A conversation that lasted too long. The easy intimacy that happened when two people understood the same language and didn't require translation. It hadn't been about Rita. That was the part he could never explain because it sounded like a defense and wasn't. It genuinely hadn't been about dissatisfaction or revenge or even desire, really. It had been about the relief of not having to perform understanding. With Sammy, he didn't have to interpret himself. With Rita, he did. And over the years, the interpreting had become exhausting. He loved Rita. He was sure of that. Or sure enough. But love had started to feel like a job he was perpetually behind on. Every conversation required translation. Every silence had to be explained. She needed him present in ways he didn't know how to be, and when he tried, it felt like acting. Sammy hadn't needed anything from him except the version of himself he already was. That should have been a warning sign. It wasn't. Upstairs, one of the kids coughed. Kris listened, waited to see if it would turn into waking. It didn't. He thought about going up, checking on them, standing in their doorways the way parents do, watching them sleep, finding some reassurance in their small, steady breathing. He didn't. Instead, he stayed at the kitchen counter, glass in hand, staring at nothing in particular. The affair had ended because it had to. Not because of guilt, exactly, though guilt was part of it, but because continuing would have required decisions, and decisions would have required honesty, and honesty would have required dismantling the life he'd built without knowing if he actually wanted it dismantled. So he'd stopped. Stopped calling, stopped finding reasons to be in the same studio. Let the silence do the work. Sammy hadn't fought it. Maybe she'd understood. Maybe she'd been relieved. They'd never discussed it. That was part of the agreement. That there wouldn't be a conversation about the conversation they weren't having. And now, her name occasionally surfaced at dinner parties, and everyone pretended not to notice. Kris finished the wine, rinsed the glass, left it in the sink with the others. Tomorrow, Rita would call. He'd ask about the show. She'd ask about the kids. Neither would ask about the evening, because he wouldn't mention it, and she wouldn't know there was anything to ask about. And that felt, in some obscure way, like the deepest betrayal. Not the affair, the silence after it, the performance of normalcy, the dinner parties where people knew and didn't say, the phone calls that covered logistics and avoided substance, the marriage that continued because neither of them had figured out how to stop it without destroying the infrastructure. Kris turned off the kitchen light, walked through the house, blowing out the remaining candles. The room smelled like wine and burned wax. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, listened. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt full rather than empty, full of people sleeping, full of a life that looked, from the outside, exactly like what it was supposed to look like. He climbed the stairs slowly. Checked on Casey first. She was sprawled across the bed, one arm flung over the side, mouth slightly open. He adjusted the blanket without waking her. Then Jessie, curled tight, clutching a stuffed dog that had seen better days. Kris stood in the doorway longer than necessary, watching the small rise and fall of his son's chest. These were the moments that were supposed to clarify things. They didn't. He loved his children, absolutely, without hesitation. But loving them hadn't made him better at being married, hadn't made him more present, hadn't solved the fundamental problem, which was that he'd built a life that required a version of himself he wasn't sure he could sustain. And tonight, at dinner, when someone had said a name, he'd handled it so smoothly that no one even noticed the handling. That was the skill he'd developed, not honesty, not vulnerability. Management. Kris went to his own room. The bed was made. Rita's side untouched, pillows arranged the way she liked them. He sat on the edge, didn't undress yet, thought about the 4 seconds of silence, about how quickly he'd filled them, about how no one had pushed back. No one had said, "Wait, let's talk about that." No one had forced the conversation into the open, and he was grateful for that, which told him everything. The problem wasn't the affair. Affairs were common enough in their world, almost expected. The problem was that the affair had revealed something he didn't want to look at directly. That he was more comfortable with distance than intimacy. That he'd organized his entire life around the appearance of depth while maintaining careful emotional remove. People thought he was introspective. He was. But introspection wasn't the same as openness. He could think about his feelings endlessly, articulate them beautifully if pressed. But actually feeling them, actually letting someone else in to witness them, unfiltered, that was different. That required trust. And he didn't trust easily. Maybe that came from his father, a military man who'd valued discipline and competence and had little patience for emotional display. Or maybe it came from the years of trying to make it as a songwriter in Nashville, learning that vulnerability was currency, but only if you controlled how it was spent. Either way, he'd become very good at seeming open while remaining closed. The songs helped. People assumed that because he wrote honestly, he lived honestly. That the man who wrote Sunday Morning Coming Down or Me and Bobby McGee must be someone who confronted himself without flinching. He did confront himself. He just didn't share the conclusions. Kris finally stood, undressed, got into bed, lay on his back staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, life would continue. He'd make breakfast for the kids, work on a song that wasn't coming together. Maybe call his manager about the film project that kept getting delayed. Rita would come home in 3 days. They'd slip back into the routine. Polite, functional, occasionally warm. And at some point, maybe at another dinner, someone would say something. Not Sammy's name, something else, some other piece of information that everyone knew but no one mentioned. And he'd handle it. He was good at handling things. That was the problem. He'd become so skilled at managing moments that he'd forgotten how to actually be in them. The dinner tonight hadn't been a crisis. It had been a test, a small, almost invisible test of whether he'd let something real surface or whether he'd smooth it over. He'd smoothed it over. Effortlessly. And everyone had been relieved, including him. Sleep didn't come quickly. Kris lay in the dark, listening to the house settle. The old wood creaking. The faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. He thought about Stephen's face when he'd said the name. The immediate awareness that he'd crossed a line, followed by the immediate relief when Kris had allowed the line to be uncrossed. He thought about the collective exhale around the table, about how practiced they all were at this. At knowing without saying. At seeing without looking directly. It was a kind of kindness, maybe. Or maybe it was cowardice dressed up as discretion. He didn't know anymore. What he did know was that he'd spent years building a reputation as someone who told hard truths in his songs. Someone who didn't flinch from complexity or contradiction, but in his actual life, he flinched constantly, just quietly, just in ways that no one called him on. Around 2 in the morning, he finally drifted off. He dreamed, though he wouldn't remember it clearly, something about a stage, a song he couldn't finish, people waiting for a verse that wouldn't come. When he woke at dawn, the house was still quiet. He got up, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window, watching light filter through the trees. The dishes from last night were still stacked by the sink. He'd clean them later. Or maybe he wouldn't. Maybe Rita would come home and clean them, and neither of them would mention that they'd sat there for days. That was how things worked now. Not through confrontation, through accumulation. Small silences that built into larger ones. Moments that could have been openings but were quietly closed. Conversations that stayed surface level because going deeper required an honesty neither of them had the energy for anymore. Kris poured his coffee, sat at the kitchen table. The house would wake soon. The kids would come downstairs, hungry and loud. The day would begin, and he would move through it the way he always did. Present enough, distant enough, managing. 3 days later, Rita came home. She looked tired. The tour had been long. She hugged the kids, asked about school, unpacked efficiently. That evening, after the kids were in bed, they sat together in the living room. She asked about his week. He mentioned the dinner, carefully, said people had come over, named a few of them. She nodded. That's nice. How was Colorado? Good. Cold. They talked about logistics, about upcoming schedules, about whether Jesse needed new shoes. At no point did she ask who else had been at the dinner. At no point did he volunteer. And sitting there, in the warm quiet of their living room, Kris understood with complete clarity that this was it. This was the marriage, not the affair, not the arguments they didn't have, not even the distance. This, the mutual agreement not to ask, the practiced avoidance of anything that might require them to actually see each other. They'd become experts at coexistence, and maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all anyone managed. Really. The songs could be honest, the life could be managed. Those were different things. He'd known that for a while. Tonight, at dinner, when someone had said a name and he'd reached for a wine bottle, that wasn't a crisis. That was just Tuesday. And everyone involved had understood their roles. Rita looked at him. You all right? Yeah, just tired. You should get some sleep. I will. She stood, kissed the top of his head as she passed. Went upstairs. Kris stayed in the living room, finished his drink, thought about the silence at the dinner table, about how quickly he'd filled it, about how relieved everyone had been. Years later, when the marriage finally ended, not dramatically, not with confessions, just with a quiet mutual acknowledgement that they'd both been performing for too long, people would say they were surprised. They'd seemed so good together, so understanding. Kris wouldn't correct them. He'd learned that correction required explanation, An explanation required honesty, and honesty required more energy than he had to spare. Instead, he'd write. Not about the affair. Not about Rita. Not about the dinner. About the space between what people said and what they meant. About the work of seeming present. About the particular exhaustion that came from managing moments instead of living them. The songs would be beautiful. People would call them introspective. They'd be right. But introspection wasn't the same as confession, and Kris had always known the difference. That night, after Rita went upstairs, he sat alone in the living room for another hour. The house was quiet. Outside, cicadas. Inside, the faint ticking of a clock no one ever remembered to wind. He thought about Stephen's face, about the wine bottle, about the 4 seconds that could have gone differently. They hadn't. And that told him everything he needed to know. Not about the marriage, about himself.